Now, Jack turned to face Elizabeth. You stayed back with Elijah, so I'm guessing he had something important to say, right? Elizabeth nodded.
These mice lost their commune because of me, so Elijah wanted me to offer them a new home here in paradise.
Makes sense, Jack mused. We end the fight before it starts, and get a bunch more gatherers, soldiers, and whatnot in the bargain. And we undermine their motivation to fight, Peter added. He swelled ever so slightly with a hint of pride. I used a similar tactic to end the Civil War on the surface. Yeah, whatever, Jack grumbled.
It's a long shot,
Elizabeth added.
These mice have wanted me dead for a very long time.
Maybe, Jack agreed, but I think I agree with old Elijah. We owe these fellas a chance at least.
I can rig up an alarm system.
Don offered.
Tripwires and some things to rattle and clank together. With all your entrances, you're a bit exposed. This way, when Matthias finds a way in, we'll know which direction he's coming from.
You do that, Jack nodded to Don. Straightening his jacket, he added, Meantime, let's gather the dames and kids here, in the middle of town. Keep 'em as far from the fighting as possible. And so it began. Word circulated quickly, for much of the city had gathered to observe Peter's arrival. Jack's men, Rod, Errol, and Cutter, returned with their respective ranks of soldiers. Rod with ranks of pikemen, armed with spears, Errol with a squad of archers, and Cutter with heavy infantry, armed with swords, axes, and shields. The civilians gathered in the center of town, while their protectors formed a defensive perimeter around the outskirts of the city, facing towards the many openings leading up to the surface. Peter's estimate proved to be spot on. No sooner did Don return to the plaza, no sooner were the soldiers of Paradise settled into place, no sooner were the civilians gathered, than there came a ringing of metal against metal from the northeastern entrance. Immediately a line of pikemen encircled the archway leading into the chamber beyond, a line of archers backing them up. You with me, Jack gestured to Elizabeth.
I'm coming too,
Don insisted. And me! Don't y'all forget me! Monster said nothing, but the way he rose to his feet, halberd in hand, suggested a comparable sentiment to the others. No, you're not, Jack retorted. I don't need any loose cannons shooting their mouths off, and if we have to retreat, it'll be easier for 2 mice to fall behind the line than 4. Stu raised an eyebrow and set his hands on his hips in indignation. And what am I, chopped liver? You, Pally, are an easy target. You stay back where it's safe, Jack answered. Jerking his head in the direction of the commotion, he addressed Elizabeth. Let's go. Don't want to keep the enemy waiting. The opening leading from the exterior chamber into the city was quite narrow. Only Matthias and a few of his men were able to enter Paradise before they were stopped by a spiky wall of spears. The rest were forced to stay behind, leaving Matthias extremely vulnerable. For just a moment the line of pikemen parted, allowing Jack Lewis to step forward. They closed ranks immediately after, preventing Elizabeth from following. Elizabeth pressed close to their backs, standing on the tips of her toes as she struggled to see what was happening. After a time she gave up and simply cupped a hand to her ear to listen. Jack regarded the mass of bodies before him for a moment. They were all caked with dust from the road. Many wore hooks in place of missing hands. A few had wooden legs, and there were not one man among them who was not covered in scars. It was clear they had all been living a relentless fight for their lives for quite some time. At last, Jack's gaze came to rest on Matthias. Let me guess, you're the big boss? The ancient mouse growled softly, and he brought both hands to rest on his cane. I am Matthias, priest of Jormungandr. Elizabeth's face grew hot and flushed at the mention of the serpent's name. She pursed her lips, teeth grinding as she swallowed her anger. That'd be the dead snake, right? Matthias' eyes narrowed at the remark. It is. Behind him, his men whispered curses under their breath. Elizabeth found herself silently cheering at Jack's insolence.
Yes,
she thought.
Tell them where to go. Don't give them an inch.
Well, Pally, I'm Jack Lewis. I'm the big boss of Paradise. As in, this city you're intruding in. So obviously I gotta ask, what brings you fellas down here? The sights, the cuisine, safe roof over your heads?
Justice, Matthias answered. We come seeking a woman responsible for the deaths of our families and the destruction of our homes, and of the knaves, the monster, and the apostate who aid her.
Jack grunted. Sounds serious. Mind telling me your story? Like how she pulled off that whole deal? Matthias lifted his gaze towards the cavern's ceiling as he looked past Jack, past the ranks of armed mice behind Jack, to the towers beyond.
We were not so different from you once. We had a village we called home. Women, children, families. We had houses, places of work and of worship and of learning, in a place where we were safe from predators, not unlike you.
And then
she came. Elizabeth Hartley. She murdered our protector, and without him we fell prey to the sons of Ivar One-Eye.
Elizabeth's blood boiled. Murder? She was the murderer? After all the mice Matthias had sent to their deaths, Elizabeth was somehow the murderer for killing a snake that would have eaten countless other mice. After the snake had eaten... That's quite a story, Jack answered, cutting off Elizabeth's train of thought. Hartley told me a similar one, but just a little different, you know.
Of course she did, Matthias answered. Women such as Elizabeth have a talent for retelling events to their advantage.
Elizabeth bit her tongue. She felt as if her ribcage might explode from the sheer pressure of all the outrage bottled up inside. Kinda like you, eh? Jack remarked. 'Cause you see, here's the thing. Hartley helped retrieve one of our family's youngest sons, see? A kid that had been lost and wandering around the city for weeks. Now, what have you and your boys done for us? You come marching down here, armed, and start making demands? Now, just try to answer me honest, pal. A faint edge of satisfaction welled up in Elizabeth's chest as she caught Jack's tone, a tone which seemed to say, the buck stops here. Which one would you be more inclined to believe? Before Matthias could respond, a burly mouse stepped forward, Gustav the blacksmith, and raised his voice in anger.
The one who hadn't murdered our families! Gustav, Matthias barked. That's enough!
Agreed, Gustav seethed.
It is enough! Enough bandying useless words while this...
He shot a bitter look in Jack's direction.
Man insults us and spits on our struggles!
Behind Gustav, the other mice offered shouts of agreement, but the woody sound of a heavy crack brought a disquieting silence over them. Gustav toppled to one knee from the force of a blow of Matthias' cane across his muzzle.
We will discuss this later, Matthias shouted. Now, get back in line!
Gustav bowed his head in submission, rubbing his nose.
Yes, of course. Please forgive me. Yes, you are forgiven, Matthias offered with a dismissive gesture.
Yet Gustav continued to glare at Matthias' back with a nearly murderous intensity as he retreated into the ranks of his comrades. Several followed him with their gaze, and then shot angry glances in Matthias' direction.
We are willing to leave the others with you, Matthias spoke up at last, but Elizabeth Hartley must be handed over to us for judgment.
Yeah, how about no, Jack quipped. But hey, I'm a reasonable guy. I have another offer for you. At this, Jack snapped his fingers, and on cue, the ranks of mice behind him parted, revealing Elizabeth at their backs. She was still leaning forward, listening intently as it happened. The moment she sensed the intensity of Matthias' glare on her, she hopped back a step. At a gesture from Jack, however, Elizabeth took a deep breath and crept forward. The ranks of mice closed in behind her, like a doorway slamming shut, and locking her in with Matthias and his vengeful men. Now, Jack addressed her, you want to tell them, or should I?
I can,
Elizabeth answered.
Tell us, Matthias repeated. Tell us what?
Elizabeth's voice faltered, her resolve fading in the face of her enemies. She paused a moment and took a deep breath.
I want to offer you, all of you, a place in paradise. It was my fault.
Elizabeth's words slowed. They felt like poison on her tongue. Each one made her want to vomit.
It was my fault that you lost your homes. So I want to offer you a new one, as a way of making amends. A home where you can, stop fighting, stop struggling, and you'll never have to make sacrifices to predators again.
Matthias fell silent as he stared long and hard at Elizabeth. She met his gaze for just a moment. Unable to take any more beyond that, Elizabeth looked away. The corners of Matthias' mouth curled into a faint smirk. It was as if he could see straight to Elizabeth's heart, and what he saw greatly amused him. Matthias' men, on the other hand, were another story. There was a great deal of chatter among them, the tone of which was far from pleased. Over Matthias' shoulder, Elizabeth could see Gustav staring back at her, with fire in his eyes. At long last, Matthias gestured for his men to be silent. He nodded to Elizabeth.
I accept.
But then a low voice arose behind him.
Heinrich, Gottfried, Sigurd, Hilda, Klaus.
As the voice went on, his tone grew increasingly agitated.
Orm, Wulfric, Liv, Wulfhild, Inga, Skard, Leif, Eric, my son, my child!
It was Gustav. Before Elizabeth's eyes, he appeared to swell to twice his size in unfolding rage.
Can they accept? Can you offer them a home?
Turning around, he addressed the crowd of mice around him.
What about your children, your wives, your sisters, your brothers, your fathers, your mothers? Can they live here? Can they live without fear?
Turning back to face Elizabeth, he went on.
They cannot. They are dead, and until justice is served, neither can we.
Matthias sighed, closing his eyes and shaking his head.
We accept on one condition. Pointing to Elizabeth, he added, she comes with us.
Jack gave Elizabeth a final look. For just a moment he appeared to be considering it. Elizabeth gulped and looked away, rubbing her arms as they shook with a chill despite the warm, earthy air. Jack looked back up at Matthias and spoke. Here's my final offer. You take your boys, you bide, and you leave my city, and I'll forget this ever happened. No harm done.
And if we refuse? Matthias raised an eyebrow.
He lifted his cane off the ground and tapped it against his palm. Jack snapped his fingers, and the ranks of soldiers parted behind him. If you refuse... He took a hold of Elizabeth's shoulder, tugging lightly. She looked up, and sensing his intent, took a step back. Then my boys bury you, all of you. At that, Elizabeth and Jack hastily backed away, the wall of spears closing in to cut off any potential pursuit. Matthias' brow furrowed as he watched the escape. Behind him, Gustav let out a shout of frustration. At last, Matthias' nose flared in anger.
Very well, then.
He motioned for his men to retreat.
We will leave for now, but be warned. As of this moment, your city is under siege. We will kill anyone we see leaving. We will kill anyone we see entering. Zibalba will be watching. If you emerge from another exit, she will find it. If you enter through another entrance, she will find it. You may last for a few weeks, but soon your food will run short, and then we'll be waiting.
Several shouts went up behind Matthias. Gustav appeared to relax somewhat and echoed Matthias' order to retreat. Little by little, the invading force exited into the entry chamber and then filed out through the tunnel beyond. Elizabeth looked up at Jack, a sudden terror in her eyes.
What does this mean?
Jack snorted and looked back down at her. Means you got your wish. The soldiers followed as Jack walked Elizabeth back to the shelter of the city's pillar-like buildings. They lingered where the structures began, resuming their uneasy watch. Elizabeth, meanwhile, followed Jack deeper in, back to where the civilians and her companions waited. The mice gathered about with bated breath as they awaited the news. "They had their chance," Jack announced. "We offered them homes among us, and they refused." The crowd burst into an uproar, the mice chattering amongst themselves in a panic at the grim news. Jack gestured for them to be quiet. "This Matthias, Jay, ran off like a little girl, tail between his legs. Don't worry, we still have the advantage. He's watching one of our entrances, and only one, 'cause he don't know where the others are. And even if he finds a few others, we got a good bunch of guys protecting us. And thanks to our new pal, Mr. Copper, we'll know it long before they get here. We got food, and they don't. We got time on our side, and they don't. We're gonna be okay." Elizabeth shook her head with a sigh. If she hadn't seen the preceding scene herself, she might have believed Jack. He was a convincing speaker, and he seemed to know what he was doing. He managed to fill her with fresh confidence, until she reminded herself that Matthias had one thing Paradise did not: an owl at his beck and call.
"Elizabeth!"
She recognized the sound of Monster's voice as he came circling around the outer edges of the crowd. The others followed just behind him. One by one they gathered, breathing heavily as they reached her side.
"What's the buzz?"
Stu exclaimed. Elizabeth shrugged.
Just what you heard.
Don snapped his fingers.
Why am I not surprised?
Peter mumbled.
"At the very least, Jack appears to have this well in hand."
Elizabeth closed her eyes, nodding.
I guess that's something.
And you don't have to get chummy with a bunch of snake-worshipping killers.
Don added.
That's something else.
Yet as he said it, Don became keenly aware of a very cold, grim look directed his way. Glancing up at Monster, he added,
Isn't it?
Monster turned his grim face to Elizabeth.
"Is it?"
Elizabeth blinked. Something was eating at Monster. She had a feeling she knew what it was, but she really didn't want to hear it.
Well, it might be. But what if it is?
She felt her cheeks growing hot and flushed as she grew incensed.
I did what Elijah wanted, didn't I? I offered those murderers a chance to make peace, didn't I?
"Are you sure that's what Elijah wanted?" Monster asked. "And are you sure that's what you did?"
Of course it is.
Don interrupted.
I mean, what else is...
Monster glowered down at Don for a time.
What?
Monster turned his gaze back to Elizabeth.
"Think of our worst enemies. Matthias, Dr. Chuckles, the Big Cheese. What did they have in common?"
Well,
Elizabeth muttered. She was very much ashamed, and yet afraid to admit the truth.
it's hard to say. We've made a lot of enemies.
"You're no fool, Elizabeth Hartley," Monster barked. "I don't have to spell it out for you. You already know the answer."
Well, what about the Arnold, huh?
Elizabeth finally burst out.
That was just a robot following commands. And what about the centipedes in the gorge and the tarantulas? They were just wild beasts looking for food. And Bill Dawson? He was just a bully throwing his weight around. So no, there isn't some kind of common denominator tying them all together. And no, I am not turning into one of them.
Elizabeth paused for breath. As she stared up into Monster's eyes, she was struck at what she saw in them. Not anger, not even a hint of his usual irritability. There was only a deep sorrow, as if he had just lost his only friend in the world. A deep growl rattled from the back of Monster's throat, which set the hair of Elizabeth's neck on end. The huge mouth shook his head.
"I don't know if I can protect you any longer."
Elizabeth felt the wind dying in her lungs.
I'm sorry.
She whispered.
I'm so sorry.
Monster nodded.
"I know. For what it's worth, there was only one thing, just one, that I would not do for you."
As he spoke, Monster began undoing a leather strap slung across his chest. To Elizabeth's knowledge, it had always been there, and yet this was the first time she actually took notice of it.
What are you doing?
Elizabeth asked.
"The last thing I can.
There was a light jingle and rattle as Monster pulled the thing from around his shoulders. It was a belt of sorts, a buckled brown band from which hung a sheath, and Elizabeth recognized what was held within.
Is that?
Monster nodded.
Your sword, the one that killed Jormungandr.
Elizabeth looked up into Monster's eyes.
You kept it all this time?
Yes, I knew we might need it again someday.
Elizabeth felt sick as she gazed at the dangling weapon. It brought back memories of the serpent's blood, and the pain, the rage which once drove her to kill.
No. Just no. I can't hold that thing again. I just can't.
Monster said nothing. He simply let go, allowing the sheathed weapon to clatter softly at Elizabeth's feet. Then he turned his back on her and walked away.
Monster?
Elizabeth called after him. He stopped for a moment.
Vengeance, hatred, they do not become you, Elizabeth Hartley.
Let him go.
Don spoke up, setting a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder.
It's just one less person to follow.
Oh? Peter, who had been listening through it all, finally raised his voice.
Forgive my confusion, but isn't that a bad thing?
Elizabeth shrugged.
Maybe not. Don suggested he and I take off on our own and lead Matthias and Zabalba away from paradise. That way there's no reason to attack. No one has to fight.
Peter nodded in thought.
A tempting proposition, I must say. And I assume you wouldn't want to be followed, correct?
That's right,
Elizabeth admitted.
Well, if you want my opinion, Peter paused. I assume you do want my opinion.
Elizabeth offered him a weary look.
If it's all the same to you, I think I've had enough opinions for one day.
Peter shrugged.
Nothing philosophical, purely practical. I don't think you can run from Matthias forever. Eventually there will be a reckoning.
Elizabeth gave Peter a frosty look.
I thought you said you weren't going to get philosophical.
Peter forced a chuckle.
The two sometimes go hand in hand. The point I'm making, however, is this. You are far better off here, where others can defend you, than elsewhere, on your own.
But are they?
Elizabeth retorted.
I think they might be, Peter mused. This strikes me as a reckoning for paradise as well. A test, if you will, of their defenses. If they can't protect themselves against outsiders, they'll never feel safe here again, and this haven will be no more.
Then you think I should stay?
Only you can decide that. But I think this may have gotten bigger than just you.
Elizabeth thought back to Jack's interactions with Matthias. She nodded pensively.
You could be right.
In that case, Peter concluded, I think it only right we do what we can to aid the defenders, don't you?
At this, he motioned towards the sword at Elizabeth's feet.
To start with, you might consider making yourself a little less defenseless.
Elizabeth gulped as she picked it off the ground. She felt lightheaded as she fastened the strap around her waist. Somewhere in the back of her mind, on some base, primal level, she began to understand Monster. Everything he had ever told her, everything he had taught her, since their first meeting in the gorge, took on a new meaning. Monster, meanwhile, wandered aimlessly through the empty city. He stopped often to admire the architecture. Sometimes he glanced towards the defensive lines of armed mice and felt a great swell of guilt as he retreated from the impending violence. Other times he listened to the murmur of civilians further in, women, children, elderly, talking amongst themselves. Monster heard the fear in their voices, but he also heard the occasional laugh, as someone somewhere said something to lighten the heavy mood. Monster wandered further in, his steps quickening as he caught the faint sound of a woman's voice. A very special woman's voice. Monster found Astrid at the center of a small group of mice. Several children, including Stephen and Chrissy, as well as a handful of adults, Bubba, May North, and Will among others. Monster leaned against a nearby tower for a time and listened. Astrid was quite animated, her eyes bright and lively, her voice and face contorting from one impression to another, as she told many a tale of her adventures with Don's crew. Children of all ages were entranced at her performance. She paused for just a moment as she spotted Monster and met his gaze. Then Astrid smiled and launched into a tale of Monster's heroism, the story of how they met. Despite the tragic tale surrounding their first meeting, Monster couldn't help but smile as he listened to Astrid describe her first impressions, and how her opinion of him grew and evolved from there.
At first, I thought he was a rat,
Astrid said.
But no, his features were too mouse-like. I felt like an insect as he passed by, muscles rippling under his bare skin, and so many scars. He was so cold. His face looked like it had been chiseled from stone. But then, there was the time he tried to smile at me. He looked so uncomfortable, like it was something new to him. I was a little scared. His smile just looked wrong. And yet, on the occasions we talked, he seemed so vulnerable. Even just listening to him talk, he was like a lost little boy. But he was strong enough to snap any of the village men in two. He was such a puzzle.
Monster grunted. A lost little boy? He raised an eyebrow, prompting a light giggle from Astrid as she caught his expression. Next, she described dancing with him at the harvest feast, how awkward he had been.
And yet, strangely endearing. I felt as if I were everything to him, as if he needed me. This giant brute of a mouse. He needed me! I felt so warm inside.
Monster winced as a pang of nausea welled up inside him. His dignity could only take so much punishment. But then Astrid spoke of Monster's duel with Matthias.
I had never seen Matthias bleed before, and I had never seen someone withstand the power of Jormungandr, as Matthias channeled it into a victim. Yet even wounded, poisoned with snake venom, Monster still had the strength to stand up and fling Matthias aside like a rag doll.
Monster blushed. He remembered the incident somewhat differently.
And that was where I knew,
Astrid concluded.
I couldn't stay, and yet I couldn't leave either. I had family there. So I let a great man go, and not a day went by that I didn't regret it.
How did you find him again? Stephen spoke up. Astrid glanced down at the boy, and with a sly grin, she bent towards him.
Well now, that's another story.
Astrid patted Stephen's head and straightened up, shining a bright smile in Monster's direction as she motioned for him to join her audience. Monster, however, shook his head and turned away, wandering back into the forest of pillar-like towers. Astrid's smile faded as she watched him go. She could feel something very wrong in Monster's manner. Hastily excusing herself, Astrid left the group and rushed off after him.
Monster!
She called out. Somewhere to her right she heard a low grunt, the closest she could hope to find for an answer.
Monster?
Astrid found him waiting in a shady alley, running between two rows of the towers and crossing the west road out of Paradise. As soon as Astrid caught up, Monster began shuffling forward once more, eventually breaking into a long, restless stride.
Monster, what's wrong?
Astrid asked, as she scampered up alongside the huge mouse. Monster ground to a halt for a moment, and looked at the ground, eyes glistening in the dim light.
I can't stay here. Not now.
What? Why not?
If I stay, I will be compelled to fight. If I fight, I will be forced to kill. And I cannot kill another mouse.
Astrid blinked, disbelieving.
You never struck me as a pacifist.
Nor am I, Monster grumbled. I fear Elizabeth is no longer Elizabeth, but honor is still honor, and wrong is still wrong. Therefore, I have to leave.
Before Monster could set off again, Astrid darted in front of him and pressed a hand to his chest.
No! You have friends here. This was supposed to be your home.
Monster's eyes were weary and dark as he looked down into Astrid's face and let out a hot, heavy breath.
More's the pity.
He looked up and glanced about their surroundings.
Astrid, may I tell you a story?
Astrid looked up into Monster's mournful eyes and nodded.
Of course, I love stories.
You won't love this one.
Monster's tail curled about his feet as he took a seat on the ground, his back against one of the towers. Astrid sat down beside him, curling into the crook of Monster's arm and listening intently as he began his tale.
The other mice used to say my mother was a witch, Monster began. I can't say for certain they were wrong.
So began the story. As she listened, Astrid's heart shattered. With each word she wanted to stop Monster. Yet as Astrid listened to his voice, she could sense how important this was to him, and she knew on some level that if she listened long enough, it would explain everything. So she wrapped her arms around him, closed her eyes, and hunkered down to share his pain. On the surface, the grass was alive with motion, as hundreds of mice crawled about. Fire pits were assembled from clumps of dirt and gravel. Weapons were sharpened, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang through the waning light. As the sun dipped towards the horizon and the cool evening air settled over the darkening city, the invaders settled in around campfires to warm themselves and wait. As Gustav worked, sharpening and repairing damaged weapons, he was distracted. Though his hands passed through motions they had repeated 1,000 times before, his eyes were firmly trained on the silent form of Matthias, as the ancient mouse sat cross-legged on a broad, flat stone.
There sits our great leader, Gustav muttered. Doing what, Sleeping while the rest of us work.
Don't let the others hear you talk that way,
a second mouse whispered. Gustav shot the other mouse a dirty look, but said nothing more. Somewhere far off there came a terrifying screech and a rush of wind, the cry of Xibalba as she swooped down upon some unfortunate victim. She was echoed with the unsettling sound of a low chuckle of immense pleasure.
"We've found one,"
Matthias announced, rising to his feet. That caught Gustav's attention. He halted his work, hammer raised mid-strike.
"Ulfgar,"
Matthias called to one of his men,
"take a small force, no more than 50 men, and follow Xibalba. You'll find an opening in the side of a wall, and not far from there, a hatch covered in sod. Wait there until you receive my signal, then enter. Until then, kill anything that approaches."
A group of armed mice split away from the main force, swarming through the grass and across the sidewalk beyond the fence. Gustav scowled after them as he watched them go. He turned his glare back to Matthias as he resumed his hammering.
More waiting, Gustav grumbled. There must be a better way.
Have patience, the second mouse answered him. It won't be long now. Glancing towards Matthias, he added,
Either we attack the enemy soon, or we attack our leader.
Don't let the others hear you say that,
Gustav mumbled. The moon slowly rose, accompanied by the occasional screech of Xibalba as she carried off new victims. Each time, the morale of Matthias' men improved a little, as a new company of mice was sent off to guard a new entrance to paradise. In the city below, bit by bit, the stream of returning gatherers and their precious provisions slowed to a trickle, and finally it gave out altogether. Jack Lewis called out the names of those mice who returned safely. Among civilian and soldier alike, hearts ached and broke for those names not spoken. As Jack stepped down from his podium, a small quartet approached him. Don, Bubba, Will, and Elizabeth, each of the men armed with their favored weapons, and Elizabeth with her sword.
What can we do?
Don asked. Jack regarded each of them for a moment and then shook his head. Nothing. Just stay back and stay out of the way. I don't need any...
Loose cannons, I know.
Don cut him off.
But last I checked, the negotiations were over. You might be needing a few cannons turned loose when the fighting starts again.
When the fighting starts, I'll need control, Jack countered. I'll need men who can stay in line and follow orders. You and your boys... Jack motioned to Bubba and Will. Are a little unconventional. Not a good fit.
What about me?
Elizabeth spoke up. 2 things, Jack explained. First, you're a lady, see? Ain't right, putting you at risk. Secondly, you're the cause of all this. If you get killed, what'd we accomplish, eh? Just made a bunch of enemies for nothing. So, no. Jack gestured dismissively to the volunteers. I want you all back here, in case some of the invaders get past my boys, capiche? Jack waited for a time, in case there were more questions forthcoming. Hearing none, he then set off on some errand of his own, leaving the others to themselves. Don shuddered.
Man, I hate this. Just sitting still and waiting for the axe to fall. At least in the old days, we were running toward something.
Bubba rubbed his gun and slipped away into the crowd to find Maine North. Will, on the other hand, was a bit more talkative. So what do we do now? Wait? Don shook his head.
Nah, well, it's still quiet. We can do more to prepare. You know, get the snares in the outer chambers and such. Speaking of which...
Don glanced to Elizabeth.
I think your little friend, what's his name? I think he could be a help.
Stu?
Don nodded.
Where'd the little guy get to, anyway?
Elizabeth glanced around the town square and shrugged.
I haven't seen him lately.
She suddenly felt very naked as she realized Stu wasn't the only one of her companions to disappear.
Come to think of it, I haven't seen Monster around either. Or Peter and Matrix.
Or Astrid.
Don muttered.
Dang, any one of them would be good to have on hand.
That was when they heard it. Somewhere far off, the sound of a rattle and clatter, as someone tripped one of Don's alarms. "To the Northwest Passage!" Jack shouted. A number of pikemen broke ranks, surrounding the opening in question, shields facing forwards and spears at the ready. They were joined a moment later by a line of archers. Arrows flew through the opening, only to bounce off the oncoming wall of shields beyond. A second alarm rang out, this time from the southeast. A second contingent of defenders broke away, encircling the southeastern exit, followed by archers. Arrows bit into enemy flesh as a wave of armed mice rushed for the opening. Those behind leapt over the line of their fallen allies, weapons flashing, as they surged for the opening. Steel clashed as swords and maces batted aside the spearheads, only for more arrows to come sailing through the openings. Elsewhere, a third alarm sounded, this one to the east. More pikemen and archers were drawn away to defend the opening. They were met with a burly mouse, Gustav, armed with a pair of razor-edged shields, hurtling before a horde of armed mice. The waiting defenders' spears skidded and scratched along the surfaces of the shields as Gustav crashed into the defensive line, scattering them like bowling pins. There came a command to fire, and a hail of arrows rained in on all sides. Gustav managed to avoid most of them, but the men rushing in behind him could not say the same. Many fell, wounded, their comrades leaping over them in a frenzy of bloodlust. "The line has been broken!" a voice was heard to shout. "Infantry, to the east!" A band of armored mice came spilling from the gap in the ranks of pikemen, waves of arrows flying ahead of them as they charged to the attack. Swords flashed from their scabbards, accompanied by shields emblazoned with the image of a fierce groundhog. It took two of them to hold back Gustav as he charged in, foaming at the mouth, deflecting blows and countering in an instant with his shields. To his sides, mice armed with axes and mauls charged forward, smashing and splintering through the waiting shields of the defenders. Unprotected as they were, many of the invaders fell, but there were still more in their wake, eager to finish the jobs left by their predecessors. But as Jack had said, his men were well trained. They retreated before the onslaught, while a squad of archers let another volley fly, taking down still more of the unarmored attackers. Then came the sound of a fourth alarm from the northeast. The invaders fanned out, cutting off the defense that came rushing to block the northeastern opening. As a volley of arrows came raining down, as the attackers fell, an ancient figure entered through the archway, flanked by mice armed with shields and flails. Matthias had finally arrived. He no longer wore his robe. As he walked, he carried his cane not as a support, but as a club. He moved with the strength, confidence, and speed of a mouse several generations younger. In the dim light, his fingers, the nails of his left hand, gleamed white, as if they were not nails at all, but the talons of a bird of prey. Occasionally they twitched and writhed, turning to the fangs of a viper for just a moment. Arrows rained down upon Matthias and his cohort, only to be deftly batted aside one by the old mouse's cane.
"Elizabeth Hartley!" Matthias roared. "Come forward and face judgment, or would you rather hide behind these pawns?"
He strode through the battlefield, heedless of the fighting around him. As he passed the clashing ranks of invaders and defenders, a line of pikemen charged for Matthias. The old mouse didn't so much as slow. In fact, he picked up his pace, breaking into a full run, meeting the spears head-on, and then he dropped to the ground. Carried by his momentum, Matthias skidded under the spearheads, under the wall of shields. His tail whipped about as he passed, his cane extending and sweeping against the ankles of the defenders. 2 mice fell to the ground with a crash as Matthias punched a gaping hole through the line. Yet there was no time for the pikemen to compensate, for several of Matthias' armored barbarians followed close at his heels to keep up the pressure.
"Elizabeth Hartley, I'm coming for you! Don't keep me waiting!"
Elizabeth shuddered as the sound of Matthias' challenge reached her ears. She drew her sword, clenching its hilt in her shaking fingers, and gulped.
Hey,
Don spoke up, patting Elizabeth on the shoulder.
you've got us with you, right?
"And Daryl," Bubba chimed in, tapping his blunderbuss in one hand. Will remained silent, intent on loading up his gun for a shot. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she finally spoke.
I want you to stay behind.
Will froze and gave Elizabeth a quizzical look.
"Me? Why?"
Just stay here.
Elizabeth repeated firmly.
You too, Bubba, like Jack said.
Don cut off any further discussion.
Probably wise. I'd rather not get caught in the line of fire, if you know what I mean.
Bubba shrugged and pressed his elbow against Will's chest. Will, somewhat irritated, sighed and nodded.
"Okay, fine."
Don smirked and nodded to Will.
Good boy.
On that note, Elizabeth and Don rushed off to the east side of Paradise to meet the advancing Matthias and any mice that managed to keep up with him. Elizabeth's mind spun as she ran. What on earth was she doing? Matthias once nearly defeated Monster in a fight. How did she think she could stand a chance against him? Matthias met them at the outskirts of Paradise. Beyond his advancing form, Elizabeth could see the shapes of the fallen, and the survivors fighting in their midst.
"Elizabeth Hartley!"
Matthias barked as he approached.
"The hour of reckoning is at hand! Come and pay for your crimes!"
Elizabeth's blood boiled at the old mouse's words. Gritting her teeth, she answered him.
You first.
Then she lunged. Elizabeth recalled Monster's voice ring in her ears from an autumn afternoon long ago.
"Stay close. Your enemy expects you to run."
As Matthias took a swipe at her with his cane, Elizabeth rammed her shoulder into his chest. Matthias staggered off balance, only managing to strike Elizabeth along the middle of his cane with minimal force. Matthias fell to the ground, partially from the force, but mostly of his own will, to avoid the follow-up slash of Elizabeth's sword. The tip drew blood as it grazed his stomach. In a whirlwind of motion, Matthias spun across the ground, whipping Elizabeth's feet out from under her with a blow from his cane. As he came up, his nails glistened in the dim light, like the wet fangs of a serpent dripping with venom. Yet he never got the chance to finish Elizabeth. A faint whistle reached Matthias' ears, and the sound of an arrow in flight. He saw it come hurtling in, and snatched it out of the air just before it slid between his ribs. Almost immediately, a second followed, and then a third. Matthias had to step back, casting aside the first as he caught the second and deflected the third. Don didn't miss a beat, firing haphazardly with barely time to aim as he advanced on Matthias. But the constant hail didn't last. Don's bow clattered to the ground as he tossed it aside. That was when a pair of knives came out, drawn from the extensive arsenal slung across his chest. The two rushed one another, Don charging to keep himself between Elizabeth and Matthias, while Matthias simply refused to back down. The two clashed for a time, two adept fighters, striking, defending, and dodging. At the close range, Matthias' cane proved little more than an annoyance. The knives, however, were small, and deftly slashed and weaved back and forth, bleeding Matthias with 1,000 cuts. Despite the old mouse's preternatural strength and endurance, he began to slow as the loss of blood took its toll. But Don was also beginning to slow. As adept of a fighter as he was still just a mortal mouse, and his clash with Matthias had pushed him to his limits. When Matthias saw an opening, his left hand struck like a venomous serpent. Don took the blow in his side, waves of intense pain radiating across his body. His head spun, and the world spun into a blur around him. Don barely felt the smack of the earth rushing up to greet his face. As his fingers came rushing down for Don's throat, Matthias caught the sight of a sudden motion out of the corner of his eye. There was a flash of steel, and a light slap as Matthias' hand flopped harmlessly to the ground. The ancient mouse let out an unearthly screech, not the cry of an injured rodent, but the shriek of a wounded owl. The edge of Elizabeth's sword was stained a dull, ruddy copper, as was the ground around Matthias' wrist, where he staggered and fell, toppled from the sheer shock of the blow. As her sword dripped, and Matthias writhed on the ground, Elizabeth was sure she should have been filled with revulsion and disgust, but she wasn't. She felt lightheaded, certainly, as if she were walking on air and staring 1,000 feet down at the ground below, but there was something else mixed in. It wasn't what she had done that horrified Elizabeth, but the fact that it filled her with a sense of catharsis, of release, of freedom. She wasn't afraid anymore. She felt strong. She felt good. A newfound terror filled Matthias' eyes as he gazed up at Elizabeth's blade, into her face, and saw the mask of hatred glowering down at him. He squirmed, his hind feet clawing at the ground as he struggled backwards, away from the approaching steel tip.
I lost my home, too,
Elizabeth growled.
I thought I would find another in your commune. I only found heartbreak. Now I've found a new one, and I've found the love of my life. And you want to take them away, too?
Elizabeth shook her head.
You had your chance, Matthias, your last chance.
Elizabeth Hartley!
The sound of Gustav's voice shouting her name immediately tore Elizabeth's attention from the defeated mouse before her. Large, brawny, glistening with sweat, and eyes gleaming with murderous intent, Gustav approached, a line of bodies in his wake. Several other of Matthias' followers joined Gustav on either side, some with axes, one with a flail.
Go on, Gustav breathed. Strike him down. The old man doesn't matter.
With these words, the rush in Elizabeth's chest died. On his own, armed as he was, Gustav would have been more than she could handle. But now, outnumbered, Elizabeth knew she was beaten, and she suspected these mice would not have stopped with just her death. Elizabeth dropped her sword and rushed to Don's motionless side, seizing him under the arms and dragging him with all her might. Unfortunately, that slowed her down, and Gustav was not about to wait while Elizabeth made her retreat. But then the ground started humming. The advancing band of mice suddenly drooped towards the road, their approach coming to an abrupt halt as their weapons grew far heavier.
What?
Gustav exclaimed as his shields dragged him down.
What sorcery is this?
Elizabeth was every bit as shocked as the others. A couple of mice simply threw down their weapons and charged, unarmed, to tear Elizabeth apart with their bare hands. Yet no sooner had they done so than a mound of earth flashed across the road. The two mice tripped, planting their faces firmly into the cavern floor. A mad howl ripped its way through the cavern. The downed mice lifted their gaze. Gustav looked up, and Matthias' chin quivered in terror as a large form came bounding down the southern street. Monster was not carrying his typical halberd. In its place was a strange metal rod, tipped at both ends with a 3-pronged hook, each prong ending in a small metal sphere. There was fire in his eyes and saliva flying from his bared teeth. It was a sight to shock and terrify even the most hardened of Matthias' men.
"Retreat!" Matthias cried out. "Retreat!"
Gustav, for once, wasn't about to argue. He dropped his shields, leaving them where they lay, instead scooping up Matthias in his arms and charging like a quarterback for the exit. Several defenders attempted to cut off Gustav's escape, only to be bowled over as he shouldered his way through them. The two tripped mice exchanged confused glances, but quickly chose to obey. They were unarmed after all, and they were deep within enemy territory. Shouts went up all throughout the cavern and its various entrances. "Retreat! Retreat!" Bit by bit, the invaders pulled back. A number were felled with arrows from behind, as a warning from the defenders to the enemy survivors not to return. On one side of the eastern path, at the end of the ridge of earth that had miraculously appeared to trip up Elizabeth's assailants, a small black-furred head popped out of the ground, clawed fingers brushing away the dirt from the edges of its face.
"Ooh, what a rush! Did we win?"
That was difficult to say. There was no celebration in paradise, no cheer of victory, only a heartbreaking count of the dead and efforts to care for the wounded. But, for the moment at least, Elizabeth was able to heave a sigh of relief.
For now,
She answered Stu.
the strangest thing just happened.
All the weapons got real heavy, right?
Stu cut her off.
Pete's idea. He had me stash a ton of magnets under the ground.
Electromagnets, Peter corrected, as he emerged from hiding, so I could turn them on and off at will. I inferred that since the northeast was the first entrance Matthias discovered, and the safest one to camp around, it would no doubt be the one he used. A warm sensation flooded Elizabeth's chest as she regarded her old friends.
That was amazing.
Hear that?
Stu grinned at Peter.
That was amazing.
Don finally stirred at the sound of voices. He winced as he awoke in a fit of coughs.
Liz? What's going on?
At the sound of his voice, Elizabeth fell to her knees at Don's side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder.
It's all right. We've won.
"For now," Peter added. Don groaned, squinting his eyes as he rubbed his side.
What hit me? It was like his hands turned into a couple snakes.
Liver shot.
Monster rumbled as he helped Don to his feet.
Matthias did the same to me once. He would have killed me if he hadn't started with his insipid chatter.
Elizabeth furrowed her brow. Just like Matthias, she had lost her chance over a few words. The thought filled her with frustration. The look in her eyes was not lost on Monster.
As for you, we need to talk.
Yes, Peter broke in, but at the moment there are dead and wounded, on both sides, to attend to. Come along. There should be plenty of time to talk later. Peter led off towards the outskirts of the city, where the worst of the fighting had taken place. Elizabeth, however, didn't immediately follow. She was frozen for a time, as a bitter, venomous sensation welled up in her throat. Elizabeth had no objection to aiding the wounded defenders, but the attackers? Matthias men? A small yet very vocal part of her insisted they had it coming. It would only be right to leave them to suffer and die. A shudder ran through Elizabeth's body. The thought held a certain appeal, and yet it didn't feel like her. Elizabeth couldn't remember feeling such a sensation before in her life, and she didn't like it one bit. Yet there it was. This could have been avoided if Matthias had simply left her in peace, or failing that, accepted the offer of a home in paradise, living alongside Elizabeth in peaceful coexistence. He and his men had brought this upon themselves. Hadn't they? Elizabeth shook off the thought. This wouldn't be a pleasant prospect, she knew. There would be many eyes on her, and likely a great deal of contempt from both sides. Elizabeth had been the cause of this, after all. It was only right she do something to make amends. So with a deep breath, to steady her nerves, she set off after Peter. Elizabeth stopped on the way, attempting to retrieve her sword, but it was unthinkably heavy to the touch, and impossible to pry from the ground, just like the other weapons. It was for the best, Elizabeth concluded. After the thrill of using it once, the temptation of using it again would prove great, especially against her fallen enemies. On the surface, in the park, the enemy mice were in an uproar. The unthinkable had happened. Matthias, their leader, had been maimed, horrifically disfigured in the fighting. At least, that was how they saw it.
What do we do with him?
A few mice asked.
Sacrifice him to Zibalba,
Gustav was heard to grumble.
That's what we used to do with cripples.
Enough!
A bellow from Matthias brought a heavy silence over his men. Climbing atop the protruding root of an old tree, Matthias held his stub of an arm aloft.
I have lost a hand, it is true, but I retain my vigor and my strength. If any doubt me, let him challenge me to single combat, and I'll prove it.
He scanned what remained of his men with a cold, wrathful eye.
Well, anyone?
Gustav stared back at Matthias, a steely glint in his eye. He wanted to challenge Matthias, the old mouse could tell, but some deep-seated instinct held him back. For all his discontent, the blacksmith still held Matthias with some partial reverence, or possibly just fear. But Matthias knew it was only a matter of time before Gustav's anger overcame that fear. The old mouse's days were numbered. That was when the light turned on. Not the metaphorical light bulb of an epiphany, but the blinding white ray of a searchlight, shining down from amid the branches of a looming tree. "Are we feeling frustrated, old man?" An engine roared to life as 4 razor-sharp propellers spun, sending a shower of leaves and twigs tumbling to the ground, and with them the drone. It caught the air as it descended, and just before crashing in a spectacular fireball, its momentum shifted, curving upwards as it sailed over the dumbstruck crowd of mice, whirling through the air, its floodlight flashing this way and that. A mad cackle arose, crackling with static, as the drone righted itself. Matthias threw an arm across his eyes, shielding them from the bright light.
You again!
Yes, me again.
How long have you been watching us?
Matthias was answered with a bemused chuckle.
My dear friend, I never stopped. I saw your men as they spread throughout the city. I saw when only a fraction of them returned to the surface. I take it dear Miss Hartley is still alive and unharmed?
That is not your concern,
Matthias growled back.
I beg to differ. I have a keen interest in her fate, but that's not why I'm here.
I could hardly care less why you're here, Matthias retorted. Be off, now! We've no interest in...
Why are you here?
Gustav interrupted.
To help you, of course. Your numbers have been decimated. I can take those numbers and make them a force to be reckoned with. I have weapons the like of which you could scarcely dream of.
Irrelevant, Matthias barked. We'll not sell our souls for victory.
Static crackled as the mysterious voice laughed.
Funny. I had heard that was precisely what you were in the business of doing. Does the name Jormungandr mean anything to you? And don't get me started with Zibalba.
That,
Matthias' voice faltered.
That was different. That was...
I couldn't agree more. The drone's voice cut him off. I have no interest in your souls. My only interest is in a temporary partnership. As I said before, our objectives align.
Matthias fell silent. He looked away from the drone and surveyed his men. Weary, battle-scarred, and without hope, all of them. It was a tempting offer, and yet it reeked of the taint of great apes. Matthias shook his head.
No. We want no part of your corruption.
Yes, Gustav shouted. We do.
Matthias froze, exchanging an angry look with Gustav.
Well, which is it? I'm a busy man.
We don't,
Matthias answered, yet his words were shortly followed by a rising sound of angry shouts from among his men.
It would seem your friends disagree.
Irrelevant, Matthias roared. It is I who lead, I who speak for Zibalba.
And what does your little bird say? Does it agree with you? Is it satisfied sitting in a tree, waiting for a meal that never comes?
A sinking sensation ensnared Matthias, dragging him down. Zibalba was, indeed, very dissatisfied with the latest turns of events. An entire city of mice, enemies to Matthias beyond her reach. an ally willing to provide vital aid, and Matthias unwilling to accept it, unwilling to uphold his side of their bargain. Matthias hung his head. In his place, Gustav stepped forward to address the flying machine.
We accept your offer. Where are these weapons?
In my workshop. It will take some time for me to load them up and deliver them. Until then, take shelter. We wouldn't want you to die before I arrived, now, would we? Gustav blinked.
Aren't you here right now?
He motioned towards the drone for emphasis, but he was answered with a crackling cackle. The drone burst into a cloud of fire and smoke, raining down flaming components onto the stunned crowd of mice. They darted to and fro, rolling in the dust as they caught fire, and uprooting nearby grass to prevent the flames from spreading. At long last, Matthias lifted his gaze and fixed it firmly on Gustav.
What have you done?
Gustav answered Matthias' gaze with a cold glare of his own.
I did what you could not. I secured our victory.